kind of introduce the subject of Brazil, which is our topic today. And I'm no expert on Brazil or Latin America, but I've done a little homework in preparation for Bruna Santos's presentation. And just want to highlight some of the things that are happening with Brazil right now, this year, and over the past year. First, some of you may have seen in today's New York Times a front page article about the forests of Brazil. Mostly we've been seeing stories about deforestation and the great damage to the Amazon, maybe a quarter of it being lost. But this is an article about reforestation using some of the carbon credit monies internationally. So that's just an example of some of the innovation that's going on in Brazil. Brazil is one of the major agricultural producers in the world. Many of the products we get here in the US come from Brazil. Brazil's agriculture also is one of the reasons on the international side it is so tied with Russia. Russia is the major fertilizer provider for the agricultural sector in Brazil. I've read almost 40%. So one of the topics we wanted to discuss with Bruna Santos this morning was how the country, as an emerging power, is trying to balance its relationships with China, the US, the EU, and Russia. And I've given one example of how Russia is tied in with Brazil. China is the largest trading partner with Brazil, with something like 1/3 of its total trade flows. The US, in comparison, is about 13%. Brazil is the largest geography and population in all of Latin America. Its land mass is like the continental US. It's a huge country. Its GDP is over $3 trillion. And the per capita income is about 14,000, which is a pretty good level for what has been a developing country. On the international side, it's really shaped in the last year by the new president you've read about, President Lula, who was previously president and then was hauled up on corruption charges and other problems, but was reelected very narrowly at the end of 22, took office in 23, very dramatically when there were riots around the transfer of power, with Mr. Bolsonaro going out and turning up in places like Mar-a-Lago. Lula has also, in this year, with the Lula administration, Brazil is the lead country for the G20 group, the kind of grouping of major countries around the world. And so Brazil has used this to position itself to articulate its policies for wanting a more multipolar world, wanting greater voice for countries from the South, and also arguing that international institutions like the UN need to change so that countries like Brazil have a greater role. That would mean having a position, for example, in the Security Council, if they can get that kind of change made. So that's kind of a general introduction. I'd just like to stop there. And while we're waiting for Bruna, hopefully she can come, give the other panelists a chance to raise some questions or make some comments about Brazil. Tyler.
Yes, hi, Peter. Good morning. Yes, you were mentioning the fairly scary events just following the election where Lula won by 50.9%, meaning just barely, and how close apparently Brazil came to producing a carbon copy of January 6th. That's referring to our incident here,
Scary
after
indeed.
Trump was defeated. And apparently, and I was not aware of this. Oh, I think Bruna's here.
Yes.
So
Good
Bruna's
morning.
here.
welcome.
Welcome.
Good morning.
We're so happy
Happy to see you.
And we had just started with some preliminaries. I think I'd like to take one step back and let our leader, June Blanc, welcome everyone, and then we will introduce you and let you do your presentation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. And so you can see that we're very good at being very flexible, and we are delighted to have our speaker now with us to continue our conversation. But in any case, welcome. I'd like to thank everybody who has been joining us both in the fall and the spring of this year for our program. This is the last program of the spring. We will start up again on September 16, and we look forward to joining you, or you're joining us for a new series of recognized speakers speaking on foreign policy to help us understand the events and the challenges facing the United States. So our panelists, I think you know us well, Peter, who was talking, Tyler Beebe, Naomi Amaro. We are recording as we're speaking. So for those of you who came in late or, or are now listening to us on demand, we thank you for joining us. You can find us online on demand on the Chappaqua website. Go to events and look for foreign policy recordings. Today we do turn and we've sort of have moved into questions on Brazil. You've learned a great deal about it as Peter made his introduction. And now we would like to turn back to Peter and have him introduce our speaker, Bruna Santos.
Thank you, June. And Bruna, welcome again. Let me introduce you a little bit to our audience. Bruna is director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. It's the only country-specific policy institution focused on Brazil in the US. And the Wilson Center is a nonpartisan research and analysis organization chartered by the US Congress. Bruna Santos previously served as vice president and innovation director at the National School of Public Administration in Brazil, and as director of Comunitas, a civil society organization dedicated to promoting social development in Brazil. She's had other roles, including working as a private sector market analysis in Beijing, China. We've asked Bruna to speak to us about the political landscape in Brazil and the challenges facing the country following the election of President Lula and taking office in January 2023. She has written about Brazil's increasingly important role in global affairs, especially at this time when Brazil chairs the G20. Brazil is carving out a unique path as it addresses deforestation, climate change, new energy policies, and shared policy priorities with the US, while also, as a BRICS member, advancing independent relationships with Russia and China, and in other fields such as energy, and getting into issues like Ukraine and trade. On a regional level, Brazil's role is important and interesting. Just think about the troubles in Venezuela next door, which has brought refugee issues to Brazil, and think about the great changes going on in Argentina, right next door. So Bruna, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here, Peter. I want to thank June for the introduction, Tyler for jumping in with the remarks before. As a disclaimer of why I was late, it has a meaning, and also it is related to what I'm talking about here today. Brazil, the south, I'm from the south of Brazil, as you can see, I'm drinking chimarrão here. In the south of Brazil, over the past few days, has been going through its worst climate crisis ever. The Brazilian federal government has yesterday declared a state of calamity in the south due to the heavy rains and flooding affecting 336 municipalities in the country. It has, because of that, almost 80 people have been killed. More than 90,000 people are out of their homes, and there is still 100 people missing. It's unprecedented, the level of the infrastructure impact of this heavy rain and of this tragedy that's happening in Brazil. The whole community that understands Brazil is mobilized, including me, and fundraising to provide support to the people in the South. It raises to us, Lula was there yesterday with a number of ministries, and it raises to us the question, how are we channeling resources to adaptation? How seriously are we taking climate change as a real threat? This is the new normal for Brazil. Lula took office, and the reason I'm saying this, all this context, is because Brazil, sometimes when we talk from DC and the Amazon and the fires, are something very distant. In my case, it's something very close to me. My family is in the South right now, suffering with climate change, and the decisions that Lula takes as a president impacts many, many people. So when we see, for example, Lula taking office after Bolsonaro, what we see is a president that took office against a backdrop of many challenges such as political polarization and environmental and security crisis. The fires and the deforestation in the Amazon is something that, yeah, Lula is making great progress, but there's so much that needs to be done for Brazil in terms of guaranteeing that we are not only avoiding deforestation in the Amazon, but we are also preparing the country to handle climate change, because those things, those threats, those strategies will keep happening unless we take it the seriousness of the issue to another level. This tragedy that's happening in the south of Brazil, and I can share with you later more links about what's happening and what is the magnitude of the tragedy and the loss of infrastructure, of the loss, economic loss that will happen. I can also share it all with you, but it's important to be taken into consideration because it is related to, for example, Brazil's new industrial policy, which is very connected to the idea or the new zeitgeist of having industrial policies focused on green transition, focused on the resilience of supply chains, as it was in the United States. This new policy will have now to have a special line in the budget to the recovery of this population and of the infrastructure that was lost during this strategy. So the reality we see out there is very challenging. And for Lula, he's facing all that, all those threats, which I would basically, if I can summarize and pick three big challenges that Lula has today, I'd say, not to mention, of course, politics, but I would focus on the context. One is political polarization. Brazil continues to be a very polarized country. As you know, Lula won the election by a very, very thin margin of 2 million votes, which is nothing in a country of 200 million people and of a country in the context of the number of voters in the country. Two is, as I said, the environmental crisis. I just gave you an example of a real, of one that is of a magnitude that it's unprecedented. Three are the security issues. Brazil faces many, many problems in terms of public security and organized crime. And the organized crime in Brazil is now reaching the borders with the Amazon basin and the borders with also Amazonian countries. So all these challenges are happening while Brazil is striving to enhance its global stature through the leadership in major international forums, as mentioned before by Peter, such as the G20, the BRICS, and the leadership of the upcoming COP conference. So with that, it's important to say that Brazil in the international arena has an enduring aspiration for great power status. And this aspiration will obviously receive a significant boost through Brazil's leadership of the G20, the BRICS, and COP conferences in 2024, 2025. So if we take a step back and look so far this year, 2023, and the early months of the first semester of 2024, we see Brazil's foreign policy seeking to assert a more active role in global debates. And the global debates where it has historically expertise and impact that are undisputed, such as environmental conservation, food security, and transition to renewable energy. Those are themes where Brazil has influence and also expertise. And as I said, its leadership is undisputed. There's no way you're going to talk about environmental conservation, food security without Brazil sitting at the table. There's no way you're going to talk about energy transition and the fact that over 80% of Brazil's energy matrix is already renewable energy. You need Brazil sitting at the table. However, what we have seen over the past year and a half almost is that Brazil's foreign policy is seeking to assert a more active role, also in conversations where Brazil historically have no expertise or influence, where the influence is very limited, such as the war in Ukraine or the conflicts in Gaza. So with that, I like to translate Brazil's strategy as a strategy of adding up battles instead of focusing on the battles it can win. So this strategy has been so far a roller coaster of ambition, and also an ambition that has been clashing with reality. We who study Brazil and look at Brazil's foreign policy on a regular basis, the way we see that in many countries in the world are positioning themselves with that strategy is the adoption of a stance of non-alignment, meaning that they're maintaining a policy independence when it comes to disputes or competition between the US and China, or the US and Russia. And this posture of independence, of non-alignment, is obviously not only in the case of Lula an ideological choice, but it's a calculated risk management strategy. That's something very important to understand. I always say that sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to say what we think Brazil's foreign policy should be, and very little understanding what it is. And I think this is an opportunity for us to understand what is the interpretation I bring from what Brazil's foreign policy is. Brazil's foreign policy, Lula himself, his advisors, his ministers, they see this non-alignment strategy as some sort of risk management, of hedging strategy. And this posture of independence has yielded Brazil very tangible economic benefits so far. So in the shadow of US-China tensions, Brazil last year, for example, began exporting corn to China, stepping into a gap left by American producers. Brazil has ascended as the primary supplier of soybean to China, usurping the position that was formerly held by the United States. So this shows that Brazil's strategy is like somehow using the superpower rivalry to get economic benefits from it. And it turns out it has been beneficial. Brazil negotiated recently, if you look at the numbers, the numbers of imports of lubricants from Russia has spiked and the price has dropped a lot. It's all because of the rivalry between the sanctions that the US imposed to Russia. So for Brazil, for the Brazil leaders today, the US-China competition is a competition happening between two very fragile superpowers. Brazil sees on one side China and its economic weakness becoming more and more clear with obviously its social and potentially political implications. And for Brazil, it's also becoming more and more obvious the American democratic institutions challenge and how it is for now, especially in taking into consideration that soon there will be an election in the United States. It leaves Brazil in a position of risk management, of, as I said, hedging bets in a world of, as they love repeating, in a world of in a world of a very unstable international system. So countries like Brazil, as I said, are waiting. So looking ahead, when we see how Lula plans to guide Brazil through a challenging global scene, and he keeps adding battles, I think that he needs to avoid the diplomatic missteps that have strained relationships with both Western partners and developing nations. And I'd say avoid missteps that have cast doubt on Brazil's capacity to act as a peacemaker, as a champion for developing nation, and also as a champion, maybe acting as a moderator in a conversation with Venezuela, for example, right now, maybe leading to a transition to democracy in Venezuela. A lot of people, I'm one of the people who criticized, firstly, Lula after his remarks about Venezuela being, in fact, a democracy and everything that happens in Venezuela being a matter of narratives. That's outrageous and disrespectful with the Venezuelan people. So he stepped back on that and has been advocating more fiercely for elections in Venezuela and so forth. But at the same time, he needs to avoid those diplomatic missteps and remarks that may raise many eyebrows and threat the legitimacy of Brazil as a liaison in this defense of democracy in the region. So also another challenge for Lula, that's one. The other one is the decision to significantly expand petroleum operations throughout Brazil, especially advancing on offshore exploration of petroleum, is something that contrasts with Brazil's proclaimed commitment to environmental leadership. So it may also undermine its credibility in global climate actions. And there is obviously a narrative, a discourse about, no, this is something because we want to join OPEC Plus to help them through the renewables transition and so blah, blah, blah. But till now, there is no clear plan, step by step, or even like a time frame for Brazil's phase out of fossil fuels. So this is what I mean about the lack of clarity and adding up battles. They want it all. Brazil want to be a leader in the renewables agenda, but still be as Petrobras, which is the Brazilian petroleum company, state-owned company, they keep their president keep repeating that they will be the last, if they have to, they will be the last people digging a drop of oil from the soil. So those are very contrasting strategies that may not add up and may challenge Brazil's legitimacy and credibility in global climate discussions. So another challenge when it comes to G20 leadership, I'd say, is effectively communicate and ensure that the world understands its non-alignment strategy. For example, the decision to invite President Putin to the G20 summit in Rio in November adds complexity to that. And facilitating this invitation, one thing is inviting him, the other thing is making an effort for that to happen in light of an active ICC arrest warrant against Putin. I think it risks overshadowing all the critical and positive objectives that Brazil aims to achieve during the G20 presidency. The renewable energy leadership, the climate finance leadership, which has been substantive over the years, and Brazil has now an opportunity to deliver very tangible results after India's, and this is, I think, an opportunity that Brazil can't afford to miss. Also, the Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. Brazil has results to show, to present. So it may be all overshadowed if the president decides to push on the making the Putin invitation happens. So those are, I think, what I mean is, when I say explaining what this non-alignment strategy means, I mean defining what are the boundaries of this strategy, what are the contours of this strategy, what's the limit of non-alignment, of defense of democracy. So this is the lack of clarity that the world sees and feels a little apprehensive on what are Lula's next steps about this. So what I think there is a lot of, in terms of climate finance, for example, I just mentioned, and recently we hosted an event here at the Wilson Center with Minister Fernando Haddad, the finance minister of Brazil. And I wrote something, I can share with you the link as well, about Brazil's opportunity as a leader on climate finance. There's many mechanisms that are out there that can be used and leveraged to help countries, as I said, and even like Brazil and cities, as the one I mentioned, that the 300 I mentioned, they are suffering now with heavy rains and the climate change impact and tragedies. There are many resources that can be channeled to that through different and new mechanisms that the development banks are working on, that nations are working on. And this is something that Brazil has been a leader in leading this discussion and chairing the task force within the G20, sitting next to China and to the US, major players in a conversation that can mobilize platforms of countries, platforms in the private sector to channel money and resources to climate adaptation and mitigation. So this is a major opportunities, in my opinion, for Brazil to deliver concrete actions in the scope of G20. And as I said, I think Brazil's matrix is clean, and in a world where you need to produce more with less emissions, Brazil's clean energy mix is a significant asset. So I always say, like, just as China has used low labor costs in attracting foreign investments in the past, it's a clear advantage for Brazil in the global race for cleaner energy and sustainable development, that the fact that its matrix is clean, any car you build in Brazil is cleaner than a car that you build anywhere else because of the fact that more than 80% of the matrix is clean. So this is very important for Brazil as a strategy, as an asset for attracting productive investments. In terms of Brazil-US relations, and is it possible then to open for questions? Because then I think it would be useful to make it more like a conversation. I don't know. But I would just like wrap up with more about Brazil-US relations. I think that when you look at Brazil-US, I always say that you have countries looking each other in the mirror. As you were all talking about before, Brazil somehow mirrored the January 6th event a year later with January 8 events. Brazil has been going through many challenges that are very similar to the US in terms of defending democracy, fighting fighting polarization. But I think that for the first time, there is an alignment of agendas, of programs. Brazil and US relations has always been interpreted as a pragmatic relationship, meaning that the US always understood, and Brazil as well, that Brazil is not necessarily an automatic ally, but is an extremely good friend and a very important partner in the region. In my opinion, the main role for Brazil and the US in the world today is to prove the world that democracies, large democracies, can deliver goods, can take people out of poverty, can fight climate change, can deliver green infrastructure. Because a big challenge of democracies today is obviously an institutional crisis, threats to the legitimacy of elections, threats to the legitimacy of Supreme Courts, as happened in Brazil. But at the same time, it's also a crisis of delivery capacity. If you look to the 20th century, the largest infrastructure projects, they were in democratic countries. If you look at in 2024, where are the largest infrastructure projects in the world? They are not in democratic countries. So this is a question that we have to make. And in Brazil and the US, in the programmatic agenda, right now, I think there's an alignment between Brazil center-left, between the Democrats' agenda here. There's an alignment beyond the partisan view of the world. There is an alignment about the need to both countries work on fighting climate change, work on delivering industrial policies that are beneficial to their populations, in delivering policies that not only build solutions and infrastructure and agility to society, but also deliver social and economic progress to the population. So I think this is a very important agenda for both countries moving forward. And I will stop here so we can go for questions. Thanks, Peter.
Okay. Well, Bruna, thank you. That's a wonderful survey of these real challenges for Brazil. And I think the call for disciplined thinking and choices, it's really the way to move that ambition. What we'll do is let each of the panelists ask a question, and then June will bring in questions from the audience. And
Sure.
So let me start by focusing a little bit more on your last point about US-Brazil relations. And I think the context there is very much what you said about the dilemma with the upcoming election here and so much uncertainty. But if you had to say, what are the several top things that Brazil would like the US to do, or what the US would like Brazil to be doing, what would you say?
So I think the first thing for Brazil, it's really important that the US find a concrete way to contribute with Brazil's green transition plan. And by that, I mean how Brazil can benefit, and Brazilian companies interested in working with Brazil can benefit from the IRA subsidies. That's for me one very basic low-hanging fruit that's out there. And that demonstrates how far from Latin America maybe the US foreign policy has been over time, because it literally leaves out of the equation Brazil and Argentina as the main producers of critical minerals, for example, because Brazil and the US Brazil and Argentina do not have a free trade agreement with the US, so they cannot benefit from the subsidies in their array. So that's one very specific thing. Obviously, renewables. Brazil has the intention to work with the US in the innovative production of SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. That's something that Brazil and the US can work together. But for that, they have to figure out ways to collaborate on innovative avenues beyond the fights over ethanol, which has been historically there.
Right.
That's a second one. Third, obviously, defending democracy. I think that we have to figure out ways to discuss how we are going to fight disinformation and the main threats to democracy, democratic institutions throughout the continent. Every country in Latin America is now somehow struggling with that. We all saw what happened in Panama yesterday. We all followed what's happening in Ecuador. So it's not a Brazil-US issue. It's a continent issue, a hemispheric issue. And as you said before, it triggers migration problems. It triggers a number of other systemic problems. And obviously, climate change. And that's, I think that takes into consideration how the US are we going to create more landing ground for Brazil and the US collaborate for that? And that means, for example, increasing the contribution to the Amazon Fund, working with Congress to have more resources channeled to that, working with Congress to maybe move forward the Amazon 21 Act, which is an act that creates incentives to defend the Amazon region. And there is one final point that I think is very important that I often don't talk about, but it's becoming more and more complicated in the region, and I do believe it's an opportunity for Brazil and the US to work together, is the threat of organized crime.
Yep.
Organized crime has taken over the Amazon region, and it's linked to all the things that I mentioned before. The threat to democracy, the threat to the Amazon. And honestly, it's such a complex issue that there is no simple way for me to make it a big statement on a tweet. I just have to say, make it a center of the agenda, of the bilateral agenda, and let's discuss how to work together.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Is the
Tyler,
oil
start with you.
Okay. Thank you, Bruna, for your very interesting summary of what's going on. A question about Lula. I think Americans were somewhat perplexed when back, I think I'm right, in 2018, Lula spent some small amount of time in jail because of alleged corruption. Was that corruption allegation ever proven, or how did that work out? Maybe you could clarify that situation for us.
So what happened is Brazil went through, since 2013, Brazil started, I think, a moment of tension between the political elites and the judiciary. I think as a result of the maturity gained in Brazil's democracy, we saw the judiciary very empowered, and the organizations that were investigating the corruption scandals also empowered to investigate corruption schemes. However, there's always politics at the table, and the Lava Jato operation became politicized. So the allegations that there was political interest in the judge that were investigating and prosecuting Lula, it's correct. It became evident. They found conversations of the justice with the main investigations authorities in Brazil there was a clear political motivation. However, there was cases of corruption, of massive corruption cases in Brazil, and Lula was arrested because of that. And then I was allowed to run for office later on because of the annulment of those investigations due to the I'd say, independence of the justices involved. So Lula was then let out of prison. PT, his party, had not worked on a successor since then. As you saw, his successor lost to Bolsonaro in 2018. And then Lula came back as, let's say, a hero, And what we see since then is that Lava Jato operation has been dismantled. And again, the operation has had many problems, but it also resulted, my main concern is not necessarily the politicians involved, but also the companies. Many companies received large fines and lenience agreements, billions of dollars that they were supposed to give back to the public good, that those agreements were just annulled because the Lava Jato operation was totally dismantled. And with that, I don't know why no one is talking about fighting corruption anymore in Brazil. It became, how, as I always say, a last season matter. So that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. So yeah, Lula was arrested because he was involved or not, how do I say, complacent, that's the word in English, with corruption schemes. But the operation that led to that was politically motivated, and they argued lawfare and so forth. But that's institutionally, it's very unfortunate to see that the largest anti-corruption operation in Brazil has been so contaminated by polarization that has been now dismantled for the benefit of the private companies who engaged on that. That's very unfortunate.
Naomi, you had a question.
Hi, Bruna. Thank you.
Hi, Naomi.
Is the violence, the gang violence, the corruption there across borders, or is there a Brazil-focused group or set of groups that you work with? And is there any connection to institutional corruption, economic corruption with those groups?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there are. There are. But answering your first question, the borders with Colombia, the borders where the Amazon is, Venezuela, that's across, in even Paraguay, that's a transnational matter, absolutely. But those groups, they are so intrinsically connected to the political elites. If you take the state of Rio de Janeiro, you have not only the militias and the organized crime, but you also have some sort of gambling, we call bicho. It's an animal gambling type of, that they control a big part of the politics in Brazil, in the state of Rio. And they are connected to a number of militias and to the death of many people in Brazil, including the councilwoman who was killed years ago and became like a symbol of political violence in Brazil. Her name is Marielle Franco. So yeah, it's definitely connected. When you look at the Amazon region, those groups are normally connected to the federal police, also that's present there. Institutions that are working in law enforcement, they are easily corrupted in the region, and also they are connected to illegal economic activities in that region, like gold, illegal mining, timber exploitation, and so forth. Recently, one of our fellows present here at the Wilson Center showed me a movie called The Guardians. I think it's available on Netflix. And it's about how local population is, and especially those that are in indigenous, in protected indigenous land, are working to defend their area. And they show how complicated it is, the presence of those illegal activities, economic activities. And the movie shows very well that the population that is actually working for illegal timber and that is related to deforestation, or illegal mining that is related to a number of mercury contamination in land, water, and indigenous people. All the people that work for them, they are just like members of the community that have no other option.
Yeah.
You know, so that's a very controversial thing when we approach the matter. So now that the law enforcement is harsher in the region for good, because Lula also worked really hard to make it happen, something that Bolsonaro was not doing before. At the same time this is happening, those people are losing their unofficial jobs. So what is the economic alternative for these people? They're going to join probably the organized crime, the traffic dealing, I don't know. So all those things are connected. And yeah, it is a transnational problem. I highly recommend this movie, by the way. It was very empathetic. The Guardians.
Okay, thank you.
I will write it down here. It was very insightful about the situation in the Amazon, in the role of these communities and the
Thank you.
June, did you have a question? You're on mute.
I was just trying to check. So how is Lula regarded by the citizenry of Brazil? Are they in support of him? I mean, is he a popular candidate now, a president now?
His popularity has fluctuated a lot over time. It's now slightly better than it was a couple of months ago, but it's always reaching the mark of no less than 30–40%. And it demonstrates also how polarized Brazil is. As I always say, Lula won for a very, very thin margin. Almost, it's still like half of the country wanted Bolsonaro. So, but I think it's obviously the fluctuation in his popularity and approval rates are obviously related to inflation and some economic measures that he was able or not to make in the early days of his government. But it hasn't been very, very positive, I have to say. And also very important to mention, over time, and I mentioned 2013 for a reason when I mentioned before, when I talked about Lava Jato, since 2013, the executive branch has lost power and legitimacy to Congress. Under Bolsonaro and under Dilma Rousseff, former president who was impeached, they had to delegate to Congress a lot of power over budget. And it obviously took out Lula's leverage also to deliver policies. So right now, Brazil Congress, which is now going through an election for the House, how they call it, president. We call president of the House. I don't know how you call it here in the US. Right now is a man named Arthur Lira. They are choosing another one. And this man is one of the most powerful men in Brazil. And the Congress right now is very powerful, which also, I think, makes the work for Lula very hard. In the first days of his office, he was always saying to the press, like, nowadays I have to spend all my time negotiating with Congress. So he's been the executive branch in Brazil for Lula 3 is way less powerful than it was for Lula 1 and 2. Not only because of the coalition that he had to build, the number of parties that are supporting him in Congress, but also because the rules in the game have changed. And I don't know when it's changing back, but I think it's important, an important discussion in Brazil.
So, Bruna, where are the bright spots? What's the good news? I can find it here too, and we're not being terribly successful.
Yeah. No, I think that the results that Brazil is delivering in fighting deforestation are very positive. The fact that we have a serious minister on climate and sustainability like Marina Silva is very positive. So the topic is on the agenda. You know, that's very important. Brazil passed this year a very, very transformative reform that's boring to talk about, which is a tax reform. Brazil has been working on that for 30 years. It's a reform to simplify the tax system. That's a very positive thing for business, for entrepreneurs, for the population. I think those are two very, very positive things. The other is, I think Brazil being back in the global stage, mistakes, missteps, problems. Brazil is leading the agenda on climate change in the G20. Is leading the Alliance for Poverty and Hunger in the G20. The fact that you are all interested in listening about Brazil and invited me here is something important, no? So I think
We're
this
here
is
for
all
you.
very, very positive.
Okay.
And I think both Brazil and the US are countries looking each other in the mirror, and our societies are so close. We are so similar. The legacy of slavery, two continental countries made out of the work of immigrants. There's so many similarities that approximate us as societies that I do believe in this relationship as a positive relationship, as I said, to prove the world that democracies can deliver.
Good.
Thank you.
Tyler.
Yes, Bruna, you know, of course, much better than we do that Bolsonaro got very close to pulling off a coup, I guess, back after the election in 2022. But in reading about it, apparently one of the differences between January 8th in Brazil and January 6th here is that in Brazil, the generals, the military was actually very tilted towards supporting a coup, which made it terribly threatening, obviously. And I wonder, are the same generals or military folks in Brazil that supported the possibility or the probability of a coup, are they now kind of more willing to accept that the election was legitimate and we've got to move on? Or is there still an undercurrent of possible rebellion by some of the military?
That's a great question, Tyler. Thank you for that. I think that the magnitude and the evidence that we have that Bolsonaro was actually working to stage a coup, and they found a draft decree in his aide's apartment, like staging a coup, so there's so much evidence of that out there that I think that differentiates a lot from what happened in the US. Another difference is obviously the participation of the military. It's hard to say the military in Brazil is a monolithic bloc. It's not. So a portion of the military took part in the Bolsonaro administration, and they took a huge number of civilian positions. We had militaries, ministers, and militaries all over. And those are the ones that helped with Bolsonaro. Right now, Lula made a number of changes after January 8th, including changing in the structure of the government. Brazil's CIA, it's called ABIN. It's a civilian intelligence agency. Before the events in January 8th, ABIN was under the military supervision, which makes no sense because it's a civilian intelligence agency. Lula changed that. So Lula made some change and ostracized a number of the military who were involved in the coup. But he made an alliance, obviously, with the ones that did not. And so now that's how he's operating. He's giving signs to the military that did not participate or helped avoid the things to scale. And I don't know if you remember, but at some point, Bolsonaro demanded a delegation of the military to oversee all the electronic ballots in Brazil and issue a report about whether or not they found evidence of vulnerabilities and in the ballots. And the report came out saying no evidence was found from the military. So some of the military members in Brazil were not supporting the coup. And with that group, Lula is now in alliance for good and bad. I'm very concerned, for example, with the fact that on April 1st, Brazil didn't make any sort of celebration demonstrating the day, the anniversary of the military coup in 1964, and showing the world that we are now a democracy, that we condemn that, and all the torture that happened over the military government. Brazil didn't do anything because Lula wanted to sign to give a signal to the military who did not support the coup that he was aware of that. So he's now in this politics with the militaries that did not support, but he had handled partially the ones that supported the coup. It's important to note that Brazil has never gone through a revolution to break with the past system. So when Getúlio Vargas, the president, started his dictatorship in 1933, he also was in alliance with the military. When he went back to a democratic government, he was in alliance with the military. When they staged the military coup in 1964, and then over the years went through a transition in the 1980s, there was also a pact with the military, making sure they still had control over different areas in the government. So Brazil has always accommodated the interests of the elites and never broke it. So that's one thing that we will continue to see.
So I'd like to come back to the trade subject you touched on. You spoke a little bit about. There are some big issues for Brazil and the US and Europe around technology, for example. And also, we haven't talked about Europe and Brazil and others in Latin America trying to figure out what to do with Mercosur. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, about Mercosur, I also don't know. And honestly, I think the fact that Milei won in Argentina now, and the fact that that Latin America has now it's a different landscape for presidents. The presidents in the left, when Lula 1 and 2 in the early 2000s, the leftist president in Latin America, they had a more common agenda. They had more commonalities. Mm-hmm. Now they're kind of, each one has their own agenda.
Yeah.
For good and bad. I mean, that's maybe a good opportunity to make Mercosur more about trade and less about ideology. But nothing is moving forward. I don't see Lula finding space within the Mercosur to exercise his leadership, Brazil's leadership, and moving forward with the EU free trade agreement and so forth. About technology, I agree with you. It's a big issue for us to discuss. I think what we have seen is we are moving towards a digital Cold War with US-China competition. And in the middle, you have Europe with their regulatory power. And that's what happening in Brazil. Brazil is obviously engaging with US companies, with Chinese companies, but there is also a lot of important regulations from European regulations, which is something of my concern. I think a lot of the regulatory framework that's been designed in Europe regarding AI, regarding the data protection, regarding even internet regulation, which is now under discussion in the Brazilian Congress, I think those regulations are made to the European environment, not to the Brazil digital market. So I think it makes no sense to import it, but that's where Brazil is going. And at the same time, I think that countries like Brazil, South America, many countries in South America, they can work to avoid a more divided digital world and have a voice as a developing nation, in a huge market. Brazil has a massive digital market. And is a massive digital market for American companies, cloud providers, data centers, and so forth. So this is something that is also of our interest to understand. Okay, is Brazil also using a more a sovereignty narrative for all those technologies. I saw recently a plan that came out of the Minister of Science and Technology, and it's all about Brazil producing its own Brazilian AI, Brazilian technologies and so forth. I don't know if that's the path, you know. I think that's something that we have also to see what are the competitive advantages of each country and what are the alliances that we have to do. So that's an important matter for Brazil. But as of now, Brazil is importing a lot of the European regulatory framework for the digital world, including AI.
Tyler.
Yeah, Bruna, could you clarify how exactly Mercosur operates, whether it's basically a free trade organization, or are there any tariff constraints on your trade with Argentina, with Colombia, et cetera, et cetera? I think a lot of Americans know it exists, but they're not quite sure how productive it is as an organization.
I'm also not sure as how productive it is as an organization, to be very honest. There are ad hoc agreements on tariffs, but at the same time, there are discussions over creating a treaty that facilitate trade among the countries not using dollar as a currency, for example. So there are, but this is also ongoing. As of now, those are mainly around import and exports tariffs, and it's more ad hoc or within the group of members, not the observers, than anything. And so far, that's important also to mention. Mercosur has is, for me, if I can translate what Mercosur is a fractured trade bloc, because there's no cohesive understandings across all the members. There's always ad hoc bilateral agreements. So last year, for example, before Milei was elected, there was advancements in making a more strong collaboration between Brazil and Argentina for import tariffs from Argentina. For example, Argentina is the second largest trade partner for Brazil, and it's an important one in the region. But it didn't move forward, obviously, because because Argentina elected Milei. Fernandez and Lula were very close and working on that. And Lula was also facilitating and making sure that a lot of the investments would come from the the New Development Bank and the Brazil National Development Bank. So Mercosur is of now as a trade bloc. It's a very fragmented one with many ad hoc agreements on trade and tariffs. There is some people who are still positive about Mercosur having an agreement as a bloc with a free trade agreement with the European Union. I'm not positive about that. I think it's dead in the water. I don't think it's happening. But it's important to note that Mercosur was founded as a political bloc. So that's one thing. So when they expelled Venezuela and then Bolivia joined, I think it changed a little bit. And as I said, like now the views of the world of presidents are different. And the fact that, for example, Brazil didn't want, obviously, to move forward with Mercosur agreement with China, and the Uruguay president wanted to move forward as a solo player, that all like generated a lot of discussions about, okay, so is this still a trade bloc or not? But as of now, it's very fragmented, and its political power has been also diluted. There is obviously if you ask someone who is sitting in Brazil's foreign ministry, they will talk extensively about the courts, about the dialogues, the working groups, but I don't see that any actual like positioning. There is a parliament, a Mercosur parliament based in Uruguay. I honestly don't know what is effective coming out of that. I'm very blunt with my analysis, because I think that if you want to read the official statement, you're going to go to the website. But I think that there's effectively there's nothing necessarily coming out of the Mercosur parliament these days, for example.
Just quickly, speaking of trade, just a quick question. How did Brazil get ahead of the US in terms of exporting soybeans to China? I mean, it's now your biggest, I think, your biggest single export of at least agricultural products. And of course, maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago, the US was the dominant soybean exporter. So I'm just curious if you know anything about that. I'm sure it's.
I know, and I
partially-
follow that closely. There is one thing about the agribusiness in Brazil, which is it's extremely productive. Over time, the productivity of labor in any sector in Brazil is stagnated, except in the agribusiness sector. So the productivity of Brazil's soybean farms and corn and so forth, the agribusiness in general is very high. It's a very innovative sector, controversial in many aspects, politically very, very powerful. But in terms of innovation, in terms of this piece of data that I just told you is extremely important. The only sector in Brazil that has been increasing in the marginal productivity of labor over many years has been the agribusiness sector. There's a lot of investment. And again, there's not much, people think that it's very government driven. It's not. It's mainly private sector driven.
So, Bruna, I think we're coming to a close with our time, but
I think June wanted to say something.
yes, June, please do.
I'm enjoying it.
A question, I guess, about your young leadership. Are people staying in Brazil? Do they feel hopeful? Or are they moving out of Brazil, going to other markets?
I think they're hopeful. I came to the US only because I'm still working with Brazil. I think they are hopeful. But that's a great question. But Brazil has been losing many brains, many, especially in engineering, in the tech world. Brazil has been losing. And the science and technology, the lack of investments over time in science and technology has made Brazil lose thousands of scientists. That's a great question. I'm a millennial. I think that if you ask a younger person on the early 20s, you probably have a different answer. And that's an answer that I should probably know. But I'm still optimistic about it. I have to be.
Well, I was curious because I think, if it's agriculture, then, you want to see growth in other areas as well.
Absolutely.
We
Absolutely.
have
When
family in
opportunities.
Brazil, and they're not leaving.
Yeah, but it's very important thing that you brought up. As I said, like the fact that Brazil's growth and innovation in other sectors are still in industry are still stagnated, and the possibility of jobs in other sectors, like in the sector, in the services, or have to advance. Yeah, and Brazil is soon to be transitioning in the demographic. It's a country that is transitioning in its demography. We don't want to grow old before we get rich, right? And that's something that's probably happening to my generation and the generation that's coming after me. That's a challenge that I think many countries are facing these days. I don't have an answer to that, but I think there are some hope in better days coming up.
Great.
It's
So
hard to do business in Brazil. for foreign companies?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Is it hard to do business in Brazil as a foreign-based company?
Yes, absolutely. I think the simplification of the tax system is going to improve, but what we call the cost Brazil related to there's trade, and then there is the cost Brazil in terms of bureaucracy, red tape, the legal and uncertainties in the regulatory environment is also something very challenging. But I think that a couple reforms that Brazil went through since 2018 were important in the labor reform, tax reform, but the regulatory and legal risk is a main issue for foreign investors. Also, costs related to infrastructure are also a main risk.
So thank you. I think we are at the end of our time. We could obviously keep pumping you with many more questions.
June, I'd like to add one more
Sure.
moderator point, if I may,
Yes.
before you close this out. So Bruna, I want to come back to how you started this out today as a reminder of what's going on in southern Brazil. And I think one of the tests going forward of the US and Brazil being on the same page and promoting democracy and pulling up our socks on both sides is being aware. And there's a cultural dimension to that. Music, young people that June has touched on. I understand there may be 40,000 students from Brazil in the US. We need to understand each other. But I also hope that all of us will think about the needs in Brazil right now and how we might help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed it.
Hey,
No,
June, back to you.
No, I think this was a wonderful conversation with you. So thank you very much. And we will be paying attention. So we will see our group, our viewers and followers back again on September 16th. We wish you a wonderful summer. May the world find peace. May we also work on climate change together and the challenges that we all face. Let's just hope that we move toward better things in the time that we're not meeting so that we will have good things to report on when we meet again. So thank you. Our best wishes to all.
And thank
Thanks,
you to
Peter.
the
Thanks,
planning
June.
committee for all the hard work they have done this year, which is amazing. If you think of the list of speakers we had, it was an amazing, and from all different countries, all parts of the world. It was a wonderful group. You're a very
Yeah.
hardworking group, and on behalf of the Chappaqua Library, may I thank you again and again for such a great roster of programs. And so I wish you all a wonderful summer. Stay safe, and I hope it is a peaceful summer. Anyone else? Okay, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Hi,
Yeah,
June.
thanks,
Thank
June.
you.